All right, welcome. Thanks for joining us today. Happy Friday. Thanks for taking time out to join us with our friends at People for Bikes and the super webinar about the status and an update on the e-bike act. It's something that we've been talking about now since I came on board in February, and we've been following super closely. It's the first ever federal incentive for electric bicycle purchases. And so there's an enormous potential for electric bicycles to reduce the number of carbon emitting car trips. And this bill aims to make them more accessible to more Americans, which could be amazing for bicycle retailers nationwide. So we hope today to provide more information about the federal e-bike tax credit to support your business and just how you can help and your customers can take advantage of this in the future. So without further ado, I'm just going to turn it over to Noah, who's our friend and our guest today from People for Bikes, who's going to lead us through this ever important webinar. Thank you, Noah.
Thank you, Heather, and all of NBDA. I'm so happy to be here with you all today virtually, talking about one of my favorite things to talk about, the e-bike act. If you don't know me, I am Noah Banayan. I'm the Director of Federal Affairs for PeopleForBikes, a close partner of NBDA's, the National Trade Association representing, all parts of the bicycle industry. I'm actually based in Washington, D.C. Most of my colleagues are in Boulder, Colorado, but I'm here in D.C. to be working with Congress, the administration, on building, advancing policies that help you thrive and help bike riders thrive and keep biking. And of course, the e-bike act really is such a great example of how we're doing that and bringing that into the 21st century, 2022, new year, new technology, and new policy. So with that, I'm going to share my screen, have a few slides for you all today so we can get going on the e-bike act. All right, you should all be able to see. So this is just the standard webinar PowerPoint title slide. We can go through that quickly. Of course, like I just said, I'm Noah Banayan, Director of Federal Affairs. My contact information will be included in the slides at the end. So if you have questions and you want to reach out to me individually, you are welcome to do that. This is a pretty straightforward agenda. It's more than just 3 slides, but sort of the areas that I wanted to cover is just some background on the e-bike act. If you're not familiar with it or you need a quick refresher, we had a long holiday break. I hope you did at least. We'll get back into the numbers and what all of those look like and the many different versions of the e-bike act that we saw last year. I'll talk a little bit about where it's at right now, today, January 21st, in Congress. What we're looking at in the political landscape, maybe make some predictions, but not many, because I hate making predictions because it's DC and, everything will find a way to go differently. And of course, I think the biggest question that deserves a lot of conversation, more than what I can even offer today, is what the e-bike act could mean for dealers. With the NBDA today, I assume many of you are in the dealer space for bicycles. And so we talk a lot publicly about what this means for bike riders and bike purchasers, but I want to have, some time to really get into what this could look like for dealers if the bill passes, define the gray areas that exist right now in the bill, and of course, leave it with questions from you all, because I want to hear what you're worried about, what you're thinking about, and how we at People for Bikes can help be the best advocate to allay those concerns as the policy process continues. So here are just the basics on the e-bike act. Because everything is an acronym in Congress. Of course, the e-bike act is too. This was fun to come up with the folks on the Hill. The Electric Bicycle Incentive Kickstart for the Environment Act. And if you want to save the bill numbers for any reason or keep track of them on congress.gov, in the House it's HR 1019, and in the Senate it's S2420. It was first introduced in the House. This was February 9th of 2021. We're coming up close to a year of the e-bike act's life, which is very exciting. And in the Senate, it was introduced in July of 2021. So this was an idea that originated in the House with Congressman Panetta from Santa Cruz area, California, Congressman Blumenauer from Portland, Oregon, and Congressman Thompson from Napa area in California. Panetta's office was sort of the first to reach out with this idea, the summer before. They were just looking for information about e-bikes. They're really curious about green transportation and electrification. And so it made a lot of sense for this congressman. All three of them actually sit on the House Ways and Means Committee, which is a very old school term for the tax committee. And so being on that committee, they have the opportunity to introduce and sort of lead and usher in a lot of policy dealing with taxes. And so if you know anything about Congressman Panetta and you know his legislative history in Congress, you'll have seen that he has a similar bill for tax credits for municipalities, I believe, for electric bus purchases. He's big on microgrids. So this just sort of falls in his wheelhouse. He also went to UC Davis, I believe, and so he's just a big, bicyclist at heart, just very excited about opportunities to reduce emissions and include bicycles, which aren't we all? Of course, Congressman Earl Blumenauer is the co-founder and chair of the Congressional Bike Caucus. He has just been the most steadfast and vocal champion for all things bicycles in Congress since he joined a long time ago, many years ago. He's been around a while. And Congressman Mike Thompson is just an avid cyclist himself. And quite fortunately for, proponents of the E-Bike Act, he's the chairman of the subcommittee on revenue in the larger tax committee. And so he's actually the chairman of the subcommittee that has jurisdiction over this bill, which is always great when you're working with Congress and members of Congress on a bill you're excited about, is getting the chairman of the committee of jurisdiction to be excited about it as well, which was not a hard ask because, like I said, he's an avid cyclist and also for a while has been looking into ways to really elevate cycling through policy. In the Senate, we have Senators Brian Schatz of Hawaii and Senator Ed Markey of Massachusetts. They're both just really strong on climate and transportation issues. And so it made a lot of sense for them to take up the mantle in the Senate and leverage this in just the large cadre of policies they lead on to lower emissions, support active transportation, and help get some cars off the road, car trips reduced with e-bikes. And then I had to think about this a lot and I couldn't really pin down a straight number. So that's why my question mark is here. But I added a number of different versions introduced with BBB drafts. And if you don't know what BBB is, I'll get to all the acronyms. So apologies for leaving that in there. But I think there's been at least 6 different versions of the E-Bike Act introduced in 2021 since the original, actual bills that you see, HR 1019 and 2420 were introduced. And that's with the Build Back Better Act, which will be a focus of what I'm talking about in a few slides. The speed at which the E-Bike Act was able to move from just a bill, I'm just a bill sitting on Capitol Hill, to being included in a sort of once in a generational opportunity of legislation with Build Back Better, that's a massive bill that includes so many different priorities. So to go from February just being introduced to, by early winters or even fall of this year, getting included in a massive moving, ideally, hopefully just a massive sort of rare opportunity vehicle like Build Back Better is actually really fast for Washington, DC, and for legislation, any legislation. It takes years sometimes, at best, to introduce and pass a bill. And so just the amount of progress we got from introduction to being included through multiple different versions of a bill through multiple rounds of negotiation, through cuts after cuts after cuts. It took a lot of effort and a lot of work on the grassroots side. I'm sure many of you were involved in some of the pushes to send letters to your representatives and your senators asking them to keep the E-Bike Act included, and to increase the values of the E-Bike Act in the Build Back Better. My sincere, endless gratitude for those on the dealer side, the bike shops. Your voices are so important in Capitol Hill. It's a question I get so often when I'm talking to offices is, well, what do the bike shops in my district think about this, or in my state? So it's, just thank you for all of you who are listening and know everything I've already talked about, because you've been following this so closely. I just wanted to show some of the different press releases and media hits around the bill. This is just a small sampling of just a really impressive media campaign. Everything from the Washington Post down here, Bloomberg, Slate. These are just some of the press releases from the sponsoring offices. The E-Bike Act has gotten a lot of pickup because it's so novel, it's exciting, it's really timely. But before we get into that, I do still want to go back a little bit to the basics of what the heck are we even talking about when I say the E-Bike Act? Let's make sure we're all on the same page. So the bill itself was really the idea child of Congressman Panetta and his team, looking for ways to promote bicycling and promote green transportation. And so they came to us with an idea last summer, and 2 summers ago? No, last summer. Yeah, apologies. Time is really hard to remember in a pandemic, but there was a lot of conversation with us, with other stakeholders in the e-bike space, and with their colleagues on the Ways and Means Committee, the committee staff, about what some type of tax incentive would look like. After months of back and forth, and us just providing information, acting as a resource, being sort of, I would say experts on what e-bikes are, how people use them, tracking incentives at the state and local levels to offer some insight to the federal level. And so that's where they came up with the E-Bike Act, which the basic legislation looks like it would offer a 30% tax credit, a refundable tax credit on the purchase of a qualifying new electric bicycle, up to $1,500 of credit, and up to electric bicycles that cost $8,000. So again, that's maximum $1,500 back, or 30% of an electric bicycle that costs less than $8,000 and fits within the 3-class definition of an e-bike, which was actually introduced into or codified in transportation law with the passage of the infrastructure bill, which is another great win for e-bikes, is getting the 3-class definition at the federal level. So, and when I say refundable, that means, say I am a taxpayer and I file my taxes, but I don't have any, income to report that year, but I did buy an e-bike, and that could be really common if you're doing some delivery work and you're using your e-bike for that work. You maybe just don't have enough reportable income. You are still eligible to receive that credit. So you don't have to have income when you file your taxes to get the credit on the e-bike if you did buy a qualifying e-bike. There was a lot of conversation about, what's the right amount of tax credit? Is it 30%? Is it more? Is it less? Of course, we would want to see the most. Refund available, or even full vouchers was something that we discussed for a while, but also thinking within the realm of what's politically feasible. These conversations started happening before there was even conversation about a reconciliation bill, which is what Build Back Better is. We thought maybe the infrastructure bill would be the vehicle, something else, but it was not very clear what the opportunity would be. But so anyway, that's the text of the bill is, again, I'll say one more time, a 30% tax credit up to $1,500 for bikes that cost less than $8,000. The bill also included that the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, which sort of would manage this program, file a report and send it to Congress after 2 or 3 years, showing how many people were taking advantage of the tax credit, what income levels those people were, so we could see, are lower income people, realizing that they can access this tax credit? Is it valuable to them? Are people taking advantage of it at the lower income level, so that there would be opportunities in the future to, adjust as needed to make sure that this is something that was, more significantly available for lower income Americans who you might, would assume could leverage the value and the power of an e-bike instead of, a car that on average costs $9,000 a year to maintain outside upfront costs of purchasing a car. We know e-bikes, of course, are best compared to cars as a car trip replacement and not necessarily acoustic bikes because of the way that they're used in just a more utilitarian way, especially in urban areas, but still in suburban and rural areas. It took some time to find some champions in the Senate who were willing to put their name on something like this and take the lead on it. But of course, we did find champions in Senators Schatz and Markey, and very grateful to them and their offices, their staff, for helping, make sure that we had a bicameral bill. It is not a bipartisan bill, unfortunately. That's not for a lack of trying, but it's, as folks I'm sure know if you watch the news, it's a tough time to find things that are really bipartisan. And we had, several Republican offices tell us how much they love e-bikes, but just we're not in a place to be supporting legislation introduced, by a lot of Democrats, and something that would have been tied potentially to a Democrats only larger bill. And so at the bottom here, where I say there's a number of different versions that was introduced with Build Back Better, that's because once the infrastructure bill started really moving mid last year, it sort of became clear that this was not going to be ripe for that package, just because of what the focus of that bill was. The tax side of it wasn't really looking at. It wasn't the right opportunity, and that's okay, because that was when talk of this reconciliation bill started in Congress, and it became much clearer that reconciliation would be just a more viable opportunity to include the e-bike act in. And so I don't need to get into all the politics of that, but I'll just say reconciliation for Build Back Better is, it's the bill that Democrats are hoping to pass with just a simple majority without any Republican support. And that's, we'll get into that a little bit later in the slides, but that was sort of what made this opportunity seem really likely. And so when the first version of Build Back Better was introduced, I can't say I remember when it was, because there's been so many versions. It was a huge win. So cool, so exciting to see that the e-bike tax credit was included. But this was the first version, and sort of when we first realized that there was going to have to be a lot of work and lobbying and negotiating and compromise. The version that was included in the first Build Back Better draft was actually, some of you may remember, a sort of shrunken version of the e-bike act as it was written. So instead of being a 30% credit up to $1,500, they basically cut it in half to a 15% credit up to $750. And they included income restrictions too. And that was because, again, a little bit more politics than you probably need here, but every tax policy gets scored by the federal government, by sort of a nonpartisan entity, the Joint Committee on Taxation. And by score means they do a lot of very complicated math that they do not share publicly to estimate the overall cost of this program, of this tax credit, to the federal government. And because e-bikes have been selling, as you very well know, very well over the past 2 years. Their estimates, again, not public information, we don't know what kind of math they're using, but their estimates really show a massive, potentially, unrealistic increase in e-bike sales, eligible e-bike sales over the next 10 years, and 10 years being sort of the life of this reconciliation bill. And so the score of this program was massive. It was $7.4 billion over 10 years. So while that's unfortunate from a negotiating stance, where we want, our program to almost fly under the radar, stay included in this bill and not sort of raise any eyebrows, 7.4 billion definitely raised a lot of eyebrows, but it was so cool to see that even at 7.4 billion, they were including this in Build Back Better. For those who don't know, 7.4 billion is not a number near what I get to normally talk about in DC on bike programs and bike funding. That is a lot of money. A billion is hard to fight for when it comes to other things like bike infrastructure or, transportation alternatives. So more than 7 billion was just massive. And so it was also really great to say, hey, look, like bikes are doing so well, and people in Congress are finally realizing that that e-bikes are quite seriously going to be a tool to fight climate change, reduce car trips, lower carbon emissions, and keep people moving, that they're, potentially willing to invest $7.4 billion over 10 years. But of course, because that raised a lot of eyebrows, each subsequent, version of Build Back Better was a little bit different and a little bit smaller. And I think, there must have been at least 4 to 5 versions of Build Back Better before the latest version, which is also like not quite on the table anymore. I won't go through version by version, but I just wanted to tell that original story of the first draft of Build Back Better, and what this looked like. After several more versions where they, adjusted the time frame, adjusted the tax credit, adjusted the maximum price of the bike, spinning all the dials. The latest version that was introduced, I believe, November, I want to say, was what you see right here, tax credit up to $900. So the latest version includes an e-bike tax credit of 30% up to $900 on eligible qualifying e-bikes that cost less than $4,000 over 4 years. So of course that's a lot more shrunken, but we were able to get, up from 750 max credit up to 900 of a max credit, which is still pretty much it's pretty significant discount for consumers. And yeah, so having that be a 30% credit as opposed to a 15% credit. Of course, a $4,000 max price for bikes is not the most ideal scenario, and we fully recognize that there are a lot of great e-bikes that don't fall in that range. So we continue to really push on that, but that sort of gets us moving to the next part, which is just, where are we now? So I've given a lot of history that I hope is valuable and useful for you all to better understand this bill, its origin, how much work has gone into it in DC, the incredible staff on the Hill. I always have to give them a shout out for just being, fierce champions and advocates for this policy when everything is on the chopping block. And of course, the grassroots, the bike riders, the bike shops, whose voices generally matter the most in DC, for filling out every sort of alert that we send out possible. So where are we now? Heather had reached out to me early December, I think, to schedule this webinar to give us the opportunity to talk about the E-Bike Act. And early December, I was really hopeful that this webinar was going to be an opportunity for me to talk to dealers and say, this is how it's going to work. The Build Back Better passed. We have, a real e-bike tax credit signed into law, and here's everything you need to know to set your business up for success, to make sure your customers are aware, to just give you all the information you needed to sort of execute on that. That is not the case. So apologies if I just got anyone excited. The Build Back Better Act has not moved. It passed the House, the US House of Representatives, but of course, as we all know, it also has to pass the Senate before it can go to President Biden's desk to be signed into law. And so while it had huge support in the House, and that was a really big success, you know, the House, you could say the House passed an e-bike tax credit. It's never done that before. Issues are really in the Senate. And if anyone did follow this, you'll know that shortly before the Christmas holiday, Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia announced that he could not support the Build Back Better Act in its current form, which means the House was not really going to send it to the Senate because it would not get all the votes that it needed to pass. That means that there's still negotiations that need to happen. And you know, the news has been sort of changing every day. The Senate decided to pivot the first few weeks of the year and focus on filibuster reform and voting rights, and that's great, although it hasn't really been successful either. So we know that Build Back Better is the priority. It's on the agenda. It's not this week. It's probably not next week, but it is coming, and the negotiations are going to, I think, start really happening soon. There's just been a lot of chatter. And it's hard to predict. It's really hard to predict what will happen. You know, what we know now is that the Build Back Better bill that exists now that passed the House is very unlikely to be the version that goes to the Senate because of what Senator Manchin said and because his vote is so crucial. So that could mean that, you know, there's just more negotiations, more things just get cut from the bill, and you just have a smaller version of Build Back Better. And that, I'm not going to lie, that like poses a very significant threat to the e-bike tax credit. The current version, I should have mentioned, included in Build Back Better, when it was scored, it's about $4 billion. So, you know, they got it down to a little more than half of what it originally was, but it's still a pretty big number for a program that, while we certainly see it as essential to everything, all of the larger goals around climate and equity and mobility, realistically, like, we have to understand that it could just get cut, and it's really hard to know what's going to happen. But that's not to say there's no hope. There's a lot of hope to be had and a lot of work to be done. There's other chatter happening that maybe they will turn Build Back Better and just into a climate bill and sort of take all of the climate policy portions from it. But what exactly is and isn't climate policy in the bill also is a big question that hasn't really been defined. And so what that would mean for advocates of this bill is just, you know, we've been doing this, but ramp it up, really talking about how important this tax credit is for e-bikes to fight the climate crisis. We know that a 15% mode shift from car trips to e-bike trips in the US could lead to a 12% reductions in carbon emissions, which is huge, 12%. The Biden administration's goal for emissions reductions is, you know, reduce 50% by 2030. So 12% is about a fifth of the overall national goal from this administration to reduce emissions. And so we think that is a really important point that we've really been shouting from the rooftops at PeopleForBikes, and has turned a lot of members of Congress who are big climate advocates, but maybe less familiar with e-bikes, into supporters of this bill, is realizing their climate potential. And so that's sort of where Build Back Better Act stands, and of course what it means for the e-bike act. What I would say is the most important thing right now is what we're going to be focusing on, what we are focusing on, is just building co-sponsorship of the bill. And what that means is just getting more names of representatives and senators onto the bill saying that they endorse this policy. That never hurts. It's really helpful to just have a higher number of co-sponsors on any bill, especially when, you know, the staff are going to a negotiating table. They can say, well, we have 50 people in the House who support this and showed it by co-sponsoring, or we have 10, 15 in the Senate. That's really powerful. So very shortly. I hope you are also on PeopleForBikes' email list, but I imagine NBDA will work together and send something out asking folks, if your member of Congress or your senator isn't yet a sponsor of a bill, you'll be getting an email from us soon asking you to send them a letter to ask them to co-sponsor the bill. Because like I said, the dealer voice is probably the most valuable in this moment and for this issue. I'll just say most offices are pretty tired of hearing from me about it by now. So your voices are really, they go far. And so that brings me to just my last slide, which again is just a sort of open question, but I'll try my best to answer with what I know right now. If the e-bike act passes, we get past all the politics, President Biden signs something into law that includes the e-bike tax credit. What will it mean for you and your business? As a dealer, like, you are the front lines of this program. So this is going to be, probably a big conversation between dealers and customers, whether that's online or in person. There's a lot of details that unfortunately won't be clear until the bill passes, and then the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, is able to sort of actually design and implement this as a program. And when that process happens, there will be a lot of opportunity to weigh in, is what I am told. Again, it's hard to predict what will happen, but and with that opportunity, we'll certainly want dealers speaking up to make this as little burden as possible for dealers. Of course, the way it works, just at its most basic, I would imagine a customer comes into your shop or your online shop, they purchase a qualifying e-bike, and there's at least some messaging or information letting them know that their e-bike purchase is eligible for the tax credit. Of course, if there's an income restriction, that's not something that you as a dealer are going to know, but at least for the customer themselves, they'll know what their income was last year, and then you will help let them know if that e-bike is eligible. And then when they go to file their taxes that year, they'll be able to claim that bike and get that tax credit. So a few things. I'll get a lot of questions about like serial numbers and how, there's not a uniform VIN system for bicycles like there are for cars. This was actually a very intentional conversation that we put a lot of bicycle representatives of suppliers in conversation with staff on the Ways and Means Committee to determine. And because each bike does have a serial number, each e-bike at least has a serial number, and the numbers are, while not uniform across all brands, but uniform within each brand, they determined that was significant enough. And then the supplier side will deal with getting that information. So basically lists of all eligible e-bikes sent to market each quarter will go to the IRS from the suppliers, so that when the consumer goes to input that information when filing taxes, the IRS will be able to cross-check the serial number that the consumer inputs with the numbers provided to them by suppliers. And that's just to avoid fraud. This isn't something we're necessarily worried about, but it's really important for the IRS to be able to, just make things watertight and avoid any potential fraud. So that's sort of one thing I want to clarify. We get a lot of questions about it. And if you've ever read the bill, you'll see the language in there. It's not super clear because it's a bill and they're never clear. But of course, if you have more questions about it, you can absolutely reach out to me and I'm happy to chat. And then the other part that is important for dealers to be aware of is at some point in the negotiations, a dealer transfer provision was added into the bill. And this was to make point of sale discounts available for lower income people who statistically are less likely to file their taxes, but aren't able to afford the upfront cost of an e-bike, but could if they were able to get that discount at the point of sale. And I know that might raise a lot of alarms for you, but we also had a lot of conversations very intentionally about that to ensure that, again, this isn't adding a burden to retailers and to dealers who have different levels of sophistication and are already, we know times are busy, staffing is tough. The last thing that we're trying to do with this really great program is make it harder and more work for you. So this would be an option. It would not be mandatory if your shop does not feel like you have the capacity to work through a dealer transfer provision. You would not have to. It wouldn't even start until 2023. So the program would basically be alive, say this passed before the end of the year. It didn't, but say it did. It would basically, the tax credit would become available for bikes purchased after January 1, 2022 through December 31st, 2024. And so that whole first year, there would be no dealer transfer provisions because the IRS would have to design how exactly that works. And there would be a lot of opportunities to comment and weigh in and ensure that that process is as little burden as possible on the dealer and on the retailer. And so again, it didn't pass. That's not what's happening, but say it did, just know that that is going to be a part of it. And for that and for everything else, I want it to be very, very clear that this is going to be new. There will likely be some growing pains. There's a lot of communication and education that will have to happen around the e-bike tax credit if and hopefully when it is signed into law. And just know that NBDA, I'm sure, and then PeopleForBikes, I know, are here for you. And at PeopleForBikes, we are just waiting for this to get passed. We don't want to, put the cart before the horse or give us any bad luck, but this is going to be a full out educational campaign. We are going to be creating resources on resources, sample materials for dealers and retailers to use on your websites and to use in store to print, things like that. So that this information is as clear as possible to you and so that you can convey it as clear as possible to your consumers. And so that's everything from just like flyers, pamphlets, signs that you can have printed out. And there might even be some like printing cost assistance too, just knowing that that can get kind of pricey. Just as many materials as possible, not too many, but just enough so that every dealer, every bike dealer in America and retailer, as many as there are, feels that they can explain this to their customers, or at least, point them in the right direction to get the information they need to make the right purchase for them. And so know that this is going to be a significant investment on PeopleForBikes' part. We will work closely with Heather and Rochelle at NBDA to ensure that we're in lockstep, we're sharing information and resources, and all of that is benefiting you, the dealer. Again, the last thing we want is to take good policy and then make it a burden for the front lines of the good people doing the hard work to make sure that people are getting access to e-bikes and a discount on them from the government. So that's, just know that we will be here for you, and not just me, like the entire PeopleForBikes team. We're just really hoping that this happens soon. We're working hard. And I talked a lot. So I think it's a good time to move on to questions if there are any. It looks like there might be, but thank you all for your patience and time listening. I really hope a lot of this was new or informative or useful reminders.
All right, we do have a couple questions right off the bat, so we could just go into it if we're all ready.
Let's do it.
The first question says it's not on the e-bike act specifically, but it's e-bike related. Mm-hmm. They're asking, what's the new federal law which includes the 3-class system?
Sure. Yeah, I see that question. So that's a great question. So the massive bipartisan infrastructure bill, is technically called the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, did include the 3-class definition for e-bikes. So that passed, late last year, and that was the big exciting one that President Biden signed into law. And so the infrastructure bill, just in basic nomenclature, includes the 3-class definition, and that's an update from a 20-year-old definition or something. It doesn't change, if you're familiar with these, it doesn't change the consumer product safety definition, but it does change the federal transportation code.
All right, and then the second part of that question is 38 states have adopted PeopleForBikes 3-class system and general rules. What are the last 2 that came in?
So apologies, I'll just say up front, I am not our state e-bike policy manager, so may have to double check on our website, but I believe it's 36 states, or it was at the end of last year. So I don't think that there is a 37 or 38th. I was going around for a little bit saying that the federal government was the 37th state or 37th transportation code to be updated after that happened with the infrastructure bill. But I don't think there are 38 states.
Okay. Next question, do we know if the bill passes, if the credit will be retroactive?
It's a good question. So the simple answer is no, it won't be retroactive to like 2021. If the bill passes this year, it's possible they may change the language. I don't, the folks on the Hill don't even know exactly yet what would happen, but I think it's possible that this would still be, so say it passes in February of 2022. It's possible that if it's just, passes as it's written now, it would be retroactive to bikes purchased after January 1st, 2022. So not a significant period of retroactivity, but just for bikes in this year.
Okay. What is the chance the act will be separated from BBB?
That's a tough one. I mean, I don't know that I can give it like a percentage of chance. I will say that obviously our hope is that it does not get separated from BBB if BBB is moving and has this lifeline and sort of comes back to life. It is incredibly difficult, if not nearing impossible, to pass just a standalone piece of legislation in Congress. Everything has to be attached to something, basically, especially if it's just a simple single tax credit. It happens so rarely, and that's for a lot of reasons we don't need to get into. So if it does get separated from Build Back Better, my next goal would be to figure out what is it getting attached to, not how are we getting it alone across the finish line, because that just doesn't happen anymore.
It looks like we have one more question. I'm opening an e-bike shop. Do you know of any grants or support I could look into, or is there anything in the bill that supports new businesses that are e-bike only?
It's a really good question, and congratulations on opening a shop, Bill. I personally don't know of anything that goes to support new businesses within Build Back Better. But I could certainly look into whether there are just grants for new small businesses being opened up. There might still be some opportunities from pandemic relief bills. I think it's probably unlikely, and there's certainly not anything that's e-bike specific is what I can say, but I would look into maybe the Small Business Administration and what sort of opportunities, grants, funding they offer for new small businesses, and maybe at the state level too. In New York, there might be some opportunities. Apologies, not much that I know of at the federal level to do that.
That's all right, I think. Here we go, just one more just came in, and then I think we can direct any other questions. What's the chance the e-bike bill would be applied to e-water bikes within the class?
E-water bikes. I don't really know what those are. I apologize. So probably unlikely, but if you want to add anything in the chat really quickly to educate me on an Ewater? I've seen like sort of bike-like things that go in the water, but I don't really know. So probably not a big chance.
All right, and then.
Oh, I do want to add
keep
this
getting,
last question
yeah, go ahead.
that came in here. I do want to address this really quickly. Does the bill include electric trikes? Yes. Some of you may have noticed that the very first version that was introduced in Build Back Better, this was a clerical error that it didn't actually include three-wheeled electric bicycles, but that was changed once there was a new version of the bill. Fully changed. So electric tricycles are definitely included as long as they fall within the 3-class, motor and speed definition. So I just want to make that very clear. Electric tricycles are included as an eligible e-bike because they're great.
All right, I think with that, we will ask anybody else if they have questions to direct them either to info@nbda.com and we can forward them, or to Noah, whose email address is now up on the screen.
Excellent. Noah, thank you so much. It's so great to work with you and the team at People4Bikes. And Rochelle, thank you for moderating those questions. And everyone, thank you for joining us today. We will have a recording of this super webinar available in the coming days, and we'll have that on our YouTube channel available. And we appreciate you. If any questions, please let us know. Have a great afternoon and a great weekend.
Thank you, Heather and Rochelle. Thanks all of NBDA. Appreciate your time. Have a good one.